Hello and welcome to the 2023 Global DEI Conference, where we unite under the banner of DEI. Brought to you by Ludo and One Business World, we are diving into crucial dialogue and contributing to making the workplace a more equitable and inclusive place to be. I'm now joined by Nelson Derry, who is the Global People and Culture Leader at ESOP. Nelson, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. I feel very thrilled to be here and to be able to share this time with all of you. Elizabeth, I was looking over the agenda again, and honestly, for the 3-day conference, and it really does look fantastic and incredible. Just packed full of amazing speakers, inspiring thought leaders. So I feel very honored and grateful to be able to make just this small contribution to all of your experience. So thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so a little bit about me. For some reason, my passions and my curiosity keep bringing me back to the topics of people and culture. And I've been very fortunate to have spent many years both inside organizations, building transformation and building change, as well as partnering with organizations in a consulting capacity, really on the topics of organizational culture, behavioral change, high performing teams, leadership, and obviously the topic for this conference, for this session as well, which is around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm also an aspiring writer and author, and in 2020, I actually released my first book, and it's called Rise of the 2020 Leader. And I remember back in 2020, I was sort of sat in my room just reflecting, and there was a lot of change, right? A lot of change happening in society, a lot of challenges, a lot of difficult times for so many people. And I guess in and amongst a lot of that, I could see a glimmer of hope and a glimmer of light. And I was inspired by, I guess, what I could see as the emergence of what seemed to be a new kind of leader. And a new kind of leader that was leading with a new leadership vocabulary, and that vocabulary, which we'll get into in the session, but it was things like trust and purpose and inclusion and psychological safety. And so I guess over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm hoping to bring some of that vocabulary to life in the only way that I know best, which is I love to tell a few stories. I might even indulge you in a poem, and just, I guess, ultimately just share some thoughts and reflections on some of the practical ways that, you as colleagues, you as leaders, you as change agents can go and lead your teams, your cultures, organizations in a much more inclusive and a much more safe way. So hopefully that is going to be a good use of everyone's time. So yep, there we go. So what I thought I'd do is I thought I would get started with sharing a story. I promised a story, right? And I wanted to share a story which arguably has transformed the travel industry. And it's a story taken from one of my favorite books. It's a book called Rebel Ideas from one of my favorite authors called Matthew Said. So any of you that are interested in the topics of diverse perspectives, divergent thinking, high performing teams, you need to pick yourself up a copy of Rebel Ideas. So I want to take you all for a moment to the 1950s and early 1960s. This is an era which many described as the golden age of travel and flying, and the glory years of Pan Am and the Concorde. And I wasn't around during that time, but I can only imagine it was a colorful and lavish era where your every comfort and requirement was catered to. And so in 1958, there's a gentleman called David Bloom. And David Bloom, he is this ambitious product development director, and he's working for a global travel luggage company. And he's at the airport, and he's just looking around and looking at the customers, and he notices something. And what he actually notices is that, in those moments and experiences actually leading up to that exciting airplane ride or that train journey, what he noticed is that actually for many travelers, it was actually a far from smooth and comfortable experience. In fact, what he saw was travelers struggling as they mustered all of the energy in their arms and their backs and their legs to drag their suitcases from one destination to another. And so in that moment, he has this light bulb moment and he comes up with at least what he thinks is an absolute game changer and brilliant idea. And his idea is, wouldn't it be great to put wheels on the bottom of the travel luggage suitcases, right? So you can glide along with your travel suitcases as opposed to having to drag and pull them along with you. And so, full of excitement, Mr. Bloom, he manages to get a slot at the board meeting of his company, and he's invited to present his new idea to the senior executives of the company. And he's done a lot of market research, a lot of preparation, and then following at least what he thinks is a very thoughtful and eloquent presentation of what is a bold and new and exciting direction for the company. His presentation receives what can only be described as a lukewarm reception, full of very quizzical looks, very skeptical looks, and ultimately dismissed by the board members and the executives as something that would simply never take off with customers. And they're thinking, why on earth would anyone want anything as ghastly as wheels on the bottom of their suitcases, right? Well, decades later, we're all here, sat here, and we know who was on the right side of history. But I think there's an important lesson here, right? It's interesting that here you've got really seasoned executives with all of their experience, with all of their commercial acumen, who are arguably in the best position to be able to see the bigger picture, to be able to benefit from innovation and big ideas, but they were blind to the obvious opportunities. And Matthew Said, in his book, he offers a thought-provoking explanation. And what he argues is that their worldview and their frame of reference was so centered on unwheeled luggage, it just made it too psychologically difficult to step beyond this paradigm and actually think differently. And it was proliferated by a lack of different perspectives in the room, a lack of diverse perspectives for such a long time. It ultimately made them prisoners within their own paradigm. And I think it's interesting because all of the evidence gathered over the decades clearly points to the fact that having diversity in teams unlocks performance. But the reality of the world that we live in today is that teams that are often pulled together to solve the most challenging issues too often lack the diversity in background, the diversity in experiences, the diversity in personality to truly unlock innovation, to truly unlock creativity. Either that and or actually the environment is just not safe enough to or inclusive enough for those differences actually to be voiced, let alone considered or actually embraced. And if we come back to the story of David Bloom, this actually marked the beginning of the end of his career at the organization. And let's just say that he was never invited back into the boardroom. And he basically suffered the consequences of speaking up with his idea, and his attempt to be able to think differently and challenge the status quo was ultimately held against him, and he was punished for showing vulnerability, and ultimately became a victim of a culture where there was very little psychological safety and there was very little inclusive leadership. And you know what? The reality is this, that whether it's fueled by our unconscious or conscious biases, actually, like-minded teams that think the same, that look the same, that do a lot of nodding, it just feels easier, right? Homogeneous teams feel easier. On a homogeneous team, people, they readily understand each other. Collaboration flows smoothly. It gives this it gives the sensation of progress. And frankly, who wants or needs the hassle of having to deal with different perspectives and different experiences, right? Because these ultimately are ingredients for tension, for debate, for friction, and arguably they feel very, very counterproductive. But the way I think about it is at the end of the day, we have a choice. And we can make a choice to be data and evidence driven or not. And if we choose to be data and evidence driven, then what the data actually says is that working on diverse teams produces better outcomes. And the thing is the reason why it produces better outcomes is precisely because it's harder. So easy doesn't translate into high performance. And look, listen, consciously building a diverse team, clearly that's an important first step. But at the end of the day, if the environment isn't set up in order to foster and allow this talent to be able to bring their different experiences, to bring their different ideas to the table, then at the end of the day, you just don't realize the benefits of having the talent at the table. And this is where I think inclusive leadership comes in, actually. And I also think, and I was reflecting on this in 2020, and I still think this today, is that actually being a truly inclusive leader has never been more important than over the last few years. And I think it's truly going to be a trait that's going to differentiate the truly successful leaders over the next decade and beyond. And think about it. If you think about the world leaders on the stage, when you think about presidents, when you think about prime ministers, when you think about senior executives, company CEOs, really the ones that have stood head and shoulders above others, that have steered their countries and their organizations time and time again through the ups, through the downs, through crises, through tough times. And particularly in the last decades, they're actually those leaders that have led with characteristics which, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, historically wouldn't have been at the top of the pile when it comes to people describing traits of successful leaders. And, the vocabulary that I'm talking about is empathy and vulnerability and situational humility, a deep, deep curiosity, psychological safety, courage, and truly listening, and truly, truly listening. Um, and on the topic of listening, I hope I think I promised a poem, right? So I hope you'll indulge me, but I'd love to read to you this poem. It's a poem that really resonated with me when I read it the first time, and it's about the role of truly listening when it comes to being an inclusive leader. So I'm gonna read this to you, and it goes, "I choose to be the last to speak. Then other answers I can seek. Each one of them is unique. There is power in embracing my meek. When my thoughts don't leak into their hearts, I can peek. Being quiet doesn't make me weak. I learn more when not talking a blue streak. No nodding or pretending to listen, not trying to think of gems so that I can glisten. Truly listening, that's my mission. Not knowing their perspective, how can I or we make any decision? We crave light, a sense of belonging. Recognition and ego, the foundation of our sinning. So can we put aside the I and begin again by truly listening, with our mouths closed and our ears open, then witness a beginning worth noting." Lovely, lovely poem. I absolutely love that one. And listen, whilst we're on the topic of inclusive leadership, um, one leader which I personally admire and respect, and who Forbes magazine actually ranked number one in their world's 50 greatest leaders list is Jacinda Ardern, who is the former New Zealand Prime Minister. And really formidable leader, and her list of incredible achievements just, it just goes on and on. And just to name a few, right? She steers her country through the aftermath of a terror attack, which is very closely followed by the deadly eruption of a volcano, and she does this with incredible amounts of empathy and humility. And then the COVID pandemic strikes, and again leads her country with such courage and such grace and such care. And I think it's really interesting, because if you think about the timing of when all of this takes place, she makes a conscious decision to actually dial up building the most diverse cabinet in New Zealand's history. So she surrounds herself with lots of diverse people that are guiding and giving her advice, and people with lots of different perspectives. And she also doubles down on all of this new vocabulary, which I was talking about, this new inclusive leadership vocabulary, at a time when it was probably the most difficult and challenging point in our society and in New Zealand's history and the world history. And I find this really ironic, because, what often happens is when organizations are going through a really tough period, what actually happens is diversity and building inclusive leadership capabilities very quickly drops down the priority list. And what I think Jacinda Ardern shows and demonstrates is that actually it's during the tough times, that's exactly and absolutely the right time to dial up and harness the power of diversity and surround yourself with diverse and divergent perspectives. Because, the thing that I'll just say is that diversity and inclusion is not something that you can just dip in and dip out on, depending on, the flavor of the month. In fact, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a project. It's not a project, it's a way of being. There's no end date. It's an ongoing journey, and so it requires commitment and it requires intent from leaders. So I just wanted to mention that. Um, to kind of wrap up a little bit. So I mentioned earlier that, there's one thing having diversity in teams, but there's no point having that diversity in the room if the ideas from the team and the perspectives from the team are not voiced, are not heard, are not listened to. And so, one of the leadership behaviors, which I think is incredibly important and is an incredible important unlock when it comes to inclusion and the power of diverse perspectives, is a leader's ability actually to create and foster an environment of psychological safety. And psychological safety has really risen in prominence, right, over the course of the last kind of 5 to 7 years, and formalized by the likes of Amy Edmondson, who's a prominent leadership professor at Harvard, as well as Dr. Tim Clark, who wrote a fabulous book called The Four Stages of Psychological Safety. But I love Amy Edmondson's description. She talks about psychological safety as creating a work climate where individuals believe that it's expected and valued to speak up with work relevant ideas, to be able to ask questions, to be able to raise concerns, and hey, to even admit mistakes. And look, let me give you an example of what tends to happen in environments where there's low levels of psychological safety. Let's just say you have an idea, right? And you are 80% sure that other people are also going to think it's a brilliant idea, then the chances are you're going to feel fairly confident, and you're more likely going to speak up with your idea, right? But let's flip that on its head. And let's just say you're only 20% sure that others are going to like it. Then the chances are you'll be a little bit more hesitant. You'll size up the implications of saying something. And I reckon more than likely you're not going to say anything at all. But in psychologically safe environments, people are just more immediate, they're more real, they're more authentic, and they're much more willing to bring their ideas to the table. And this is the important part, because it won't be held against them. And I love how Dr. Tim Clark describes it. He describes psychological safety as rewarding vulnerability. And so without fostering an environment where there's the freedom to fail. Guess what? People are just going to seek to do something that's been good enough in the past, right? And so what happens is their work is going to be derivative. The work is not going to be innovative. So in the same way, when we first learn to ride a bicycle, no one really learns to pedal gracefully without falling over a few times, right? So in the same way, unlocking creativity, innovation, it requires experimentation, it requires trial, it requires error, but it needs to be done in an environment where, bringing new and diverse perspectives is embraced, and it's not one where it's held against you. Um, and finally, I just wanted to share some of my favorite practical psychological safety. I don't know if I call them tips, but small behaviors that we can all take away as colleagues and as leaders. And I wanted to start with ensuring all ideas are heard and evaluated equally. And so there's this great quote from Susan Cain, and she says, "There's no correlation between being the best talker and having the best ideas." So often what you'll find is that when teams come together to kind of solve problems, to have a creative kind of idea generation meeting, what they often tend to do is they default to brainstorming. Don't get me wrong, brainstorming definitely has an important role to play when it comes to the idea generation process. But I think what you often find is that 80% of the ideas are often generated from 20% of the room. And this can actually be compounded when ideas are actually being discussed remotely or virtually by teams. And so, as I said to you, I don't necessarily think that we should discount brainstorming, but I do believe in balance. And so an alternative way to create that balance is actually and a way of actually encouraging all ideas and perspectives from all team members to be heard is actually to ask team members to write their ideas down first. And ideally to do this anonymously. And then what the team and the group does is it takes the time to discuss every single idea on its merit. And what you'll find is that then it just has this impact of everyone feeling heard. And the knock-on impact of that is then the teams make better decisions because ideas are democratized and ideas are evaluated on the strength of the idea and not who it came from. And I think that's really, really important. I think that's really, really powerful. The other example is speak last in meetings. So as the most senior person in a room, leaders can often feel compelled to, start the conversation or do the majority of the talking in a team meeting. And I think it sometimes comes from a positive intent just to get the ball going, right, and get the conversations going. But the problem is that if that happens too consistently and consistently that person is the dominant or the first voice in the room, it can actually have the unintentional effects of what's known in behavioral science as the mirroring effect. And what it does is team members actually consciously or subconsciously actually gravitate to the person of authority in the room. And ultimately, team members either default to agreeing with everything that you say as a leader, or they don't feel safe enough to be able to challenge and offer different perspectives. And, I guess over time, this approach just creates disengagement and it stifles the richness of the discussion and the idea generation process you would have got had you created an environment where diverse thinking and perspectives could be voiced and not influenced by the person who spoke first. The last example is replace blame or skepticism with curiosity. And I have a thought on bias, and it's that whether we like it or not, we're all riddled with biases. And there's this great quote that says, "We're not responsible for our first thought, but we are responsible for our second thought and for our first action." And so that's where our power lies. It lies between our first thought and our first action. And so if someone raises an issue or shares a new idea or a new perspective in the same way that our friend David Bloom did, then it's actually a really important moment after your first thought to get into the practice of pausing and to listening deeply and to take the opportunity to actually adopt a curious and a learning mindset and approach. And that approach is replacing blame with curiosity and replacing skepticism with curiosity. And, a very simple way of doing that and to get into that frame of mind is actually to use language that is open. So things such as, tell me more. How can I help and support you? And I think this is really simple, but actually sends really powerful signals to the other person of safety and of support. Um, Look, we've come to the end of the presentation, so thank you so much for having me. I'll just leave you all with a final thought, which is, I truly believe that when diversity in teams and psychological safety come together in harmony, I really do believe that they become powerful unlocks for innovation, for creativity, and for performance in teams, in organizations, as well as in cultures. Thank you very much.
Nelson, that was great. And there was a few things that pinged out for me that I wanted just to pick up on. Um, this piece around, we all have a choice and listen to the evidence. And, we know diverse teams do produce a better outcome. And actually the stats are there, which allows us to really find that evidence that sometimes is required to have the investment to really move the dial in workplaces.
Mm.
In terms of talking about replacing blame with skepticism or curiosity at the end, I wrote that down. Like, that's a real line for me that I'm going to take forward into the work that I do. So thank you so much for that. And then finally, that poem, my gosh. Wow, I've never heard it before. It's brilliant. I'm really glad that we have a copy of your slides. I want to really take that one away and just process that in my own time. So thank you for all your great insights and sharing today. I'm really grateful. Thank you,
Oh,
Nelson.
thank you so much. Such an honor to be here. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.